Thank you. So just begin to settle into a meditative posture that feels comfortable. Maybe gently resting the eyes closed if that feels suitable for your practice. And just see if in this comfortable posture you can maintain a somewhat upright spine. And that can be very beneficial to our capacity for concentration. And just beginning taking some longer, deeper breaths, and just being aware of the belly, the lower lungs as they fill with air, and then being aware of the ribs as they float from in to out with each breath. And aware of the lungs filling the upper chest, almost imagining the shoulders rising with each breath. And then taking a few breaths, just aware of all three parts of these lungs filling with air, the belly expanding outward, the ribs and the middle chest expanding outward, and the upper lungs, chest, and the shoulders rising. And once you fully fill the lungs with air, just hold it for a second or two. And then sigh out the deep breath. Just do that on your own a few times. And just filling these three different sections of the lungs with air, holding and releasing. And allowing the breath to return to its normal rhythm. Just aware that there is a body sitting, There is a body breathing. And as you feel the body sitting and breathing, feel free to invite any areas of tension that are being held to release. And maybe welcoming a sense of softening to the muscles of the face, the forehead, the eyes, the ears, the cheeks, maybe even wiggling the jaw. And softening the space between the back of the head and the neck. And then the neck itself. Just allowing the shoulders to drop down away from the ears. Moving through the rest of your body at your own pace. Just aware that we don't actually control whether tension stays or it goes. All we do is offer the invitation. And holding the whole body in our field of awareness. It's curious about what is the experience of being here and now. What are the sensations of sitting and of breathing? Aware of the sensations of the feet against the floor. aware of sensations in the hands, be aware of the vibrating or tingling, and itching and aching and pulsing. Feeling of dampness or dryness, feeling of coolness or warmth. And aware of sensations in and around the mouth, the gums, and you can even take the tongue and move it around the mouth just a little bit, noticing texture, noticing sensation. Now just asking ourselves the question, where in the body are there pleasant sensations? And any time in the body may have a slew of unpleasant sensations, neutral sensations, and pleasant sensations. So just notice if anywhere pops into the mind or awareness of here are pleasant sensations. Wherever those pleasant sensations are, you can bring the attention to rest there with the sensations. And if it feels hard to access or become aware of any pleasant sensations, you can always use the mind to at least attempt to generate pleasant sensations. Maybe thinking of a small animal or a pet that you care deeply for, or reflecting on the moment of kindness, moment of goodness you've experienced in your life recently. Even thinking of something delicious you ate. And just notice if any pleasant sensations arise. And once the sensations arise, you can drop the story, the thinking about it. Just enjoy being with the pleasant sensations. Be curious about them. What do they feel like? How is it changing constantly? Where does the sensation start? And where does it end? And pleasant sensations arise and change and pass away. It's like all other things. So no need to claim. You can always find other pleasant sensations in the body, or generate more using the mind. And just come back to resting the attention on the in breath and the out breath. Just aware that there is a body breathing, there is a body sitting. There are pleasant sensations, unpleasant sensations, neutral sensations. And just taking a few more longer, deeper breaths. Just aware of the sensation of breathing. And in your own time, bringing some subtle movements to the body. And whenever you're ready, gently opening the eyes. And so now we'll take it's about a 5-minute break. If you need to use the bathroom, get some water, anything. Maybe in a few minutes, I'll very gently guide some mindful movement, but that can also be something that's done on your own or just skipped. We'll reconvene at about 11:05. Coming back whenever people are ready. So I'll give a little talk here and then we'll have space afterwards for comments, questions, particularly just for making sure there's space for everyone to be able to share what's alive for them, what's happening in their practice, in their life, in their world. So today's talk, and we're going to talk a little about pleasure, a little bit about pain, a little bit about the middle way. And I was on a retreat last week, and I decided I'd just give a talk on whatever felt alive for me on the last day of the retreat. And I have this experience on retreat fairly regularly of on the last day of the retreat, I'll close my eyes and I imagine that it's actually not the last day of the retreat, but it's the first day of the retreat. And depending on how I'm feeling in that moment, that is a moment of an extreme pleasant fantasy or a moment of abject horror. And it really just depends on the moment. You know, everyone here is, meditated or has been on retreat knows that there are a lot of highs and lows. And especially, on retreat when we're sort of away from the things that numb some of our highs and lows, there's these huge vacillations back and forth. So, one day I'll be having a nice, beautiful sit, and I'll be thinking about how, oh, I should have ordained as a monk. Like, what was I doing? And then an hour later, I'll be, you know, thinking about maybe I should try heroin. Like, what's the point? Like, these are real thoughts that the mind comes up with. And so there's all these other extremes on retreats, things that are so common now. They even have names. It's called a Vipassana vendetta. Vipassana is the type of meditation, insight meditation, and the Vipassana vendetta is sometimes on retreat. I just see someone, no idea their name, don't know who they are, no, nothing about them. You just decide, I don't like this person. Like, this person's the worst. The way they walk too slow or too fast, or they're trying too hard or not hard enough. And so the mind fixates, it creates these kind of extreme stories. And the opposite of that is the Vipassana romance. You see someone, and sometimes it's romantic, sometimes it's platonic. Like, this is the most amazing, coolest person. Like, they have the most amazing meditation practice. If only I knew their name, we could be friends forever. And so there are all these kind of extremes, these highs and lows. And there's a lot of moments of deep pleasure and a lot of moments of deep pain. I mean, both psychologically and physically, just sitting, experienced some incredible pain on meditation retreats that's sent me to physical therapy. So there's this whole range of experiences. And again, this is why in life we have all these coping mechanisms. We have all these, vices. We have all these distractions. We have all these to-do lists and plans and goals and things that sort of numb us from these wild sways of extremes. And just being on a meditation retreat or just in a meditation, a 30-minute meditation, there's nowhere really to hide. And so what is the practice we're doing with meditation where we're learning to be with these extremes, these pains, these pleasures, these highs, these lows? So the teacher on this retreat, Bhante Rahula, is a very wise teacher I've studied with before. He offered just this very basic insight, which is, okay, what is the MEDI of meditate? Like, what are other words that start with MEDI? Like mediate, medicine, media, medium, mediocre. Okay, MEDI basically just means the middle. So mediocre is the middle of good and bad. Mediate is the middle of two conflicting parties. Medicine is the middle of sickness and health. So in meditation, basically, we are practicing staying in the middle. And sort of expounding on this, you shared, so what exactly are we staying in the middle of? He names 3 things here. So the first is that we're staying in the middle of the past and the future. Somewhat self-explanatory. The present, staying in the middle. The next thing we're staying in the middle of is self and not self. This can be a little more complicated, but the very basic idea of it is that we are just relating to experience in meditation, basically non-dualistically. There is just the experience itself. Okay? Seeing things impersonally. Sensation is just sensation. Sounds are just sounds. Experience is just itself. We're finding the middle of self and not self. And the last one I mentioned is pain and pleasure. And this is what we're talking about more today. So pain and pleasure are on the list of dualities in the Buddhist canon. And I believe Hugh actually gave a talk about this in May, the 8 worldly winds. So I'm going to talk about it briefly. But basically, the 8 worldly winds are pain and pleasure, gain and loss, praise and blame, fame and disgrace. And so these are all dualities. You could say we're practicing being in the middle of all of them. And so this comes from what's called the Lokavapati Sutta. And I use a translation from translator Bhante Sujato. I'm just going to read a little bit from the text. And I'll kind of move from piece to piece. I won't read the whole thing from top to bottom. The Buddha, if you've ever read any suttas, you know that the Buddha liked to repeat himself, oftentimes 3 times, which is extremely useful, but it's not the total focus of our talk today. So I'll move through it a little quicker. But basically, he says that the 8 worldly conditions revolve around the world, and the world revolves around the 8 worldly conditions. And these are gain and loss, fame and disgrace, blame and praise, pleasure and pain. And basically, he's asked the question from his monks, okay, so everyone experiences these things. So what is the difference between how it's handled by what they call an unlearned person, an unlearned ordinary person, which is just someone who has not learned from Dharma teachers, not on the path of the Buddha, versus a learned noble disciple. And so what is the difference between how these 2 people handle these 8 worldly winds, which happens to everybody? So he says, an unlearned ordinary person encounters gain. They don't reflect, I've encountered this gain. It's impermanent, suffering, and perishable. They don't truly understand it. So gain and loss, fame and disgrace, blame and praise, and pleasure and pain occupy their minds. They favor gain and oppose loss. They favor fame and oppose disgrace. They favor praise and oppose blame. They favor pleasure and oppose pain. Being so full of favoring and opposing, they're not freed from rebirth, old age, and death, from sorrow, lamentation, pain, sadness, and distress. They are not freed from suffering, I say. And so the opposite of that is a learned noble person. So they reflect, I've encountered this gain. It is impermanent. It is suffering. It is perishable. They truly understand it. And because they truly understand it, it does not occupy their minds. They don't favor gain or oppose loss. They don't favor fame or oppose disgrace. So this is basically the difference between a noble disciple and the unlearned ordinary person. So basically what he's saying is to stay in the middle is to be free from suffering. And I have a couple of stories I absolutely love about this idea of staying in the middle. First one, both are from the Thai forest tradition. The first one is from a teacher, Ajahn Sumedho, who's somewhat considered like the Western head of the Thai forest tradition. And he studied with Ajahn Chah, who's a very revered Thai forest teacher. Some of you may, if you've read Jack Kornfield, he was Jack Kornfield's teacher. There's a story of Ajahn Sumedho as a young monk. And he was practicing meditation in his kuti, his little hut in Thailand in the jungle. And he hears this horrible squealing noise. And so, being curious, monk, he walks out of his kuti and he sees in front of him this giant snake. And in the snake's mouth is this bullfrog. And this bullfrog is making this horrific noise. And so he's just sort of staring there. He's like frozen. And he hears a voice behind him, and the voice is Ajahn Chah. And all Ajahn Chah says is, "Don't take sides," and then walks away. And I love that story because even as I tell the story, even as I share it, it's hard for me not to take sides in the story, or to feel a certain way about it. And staying in the middle can be quite hard. Now, I'll share one more story that demonstrates the beauty of this, which is also from Ajahn Chah, and it's the story of a woman who had ordained in the Thai forest tradition as a nun and practiced in the tradition for 10 years. And she decided one day, she was an American, she had enough, and she went back to the US. And when she came back to the US, she converted to Christianity. And she became an evangelical Christian. And upon doing that, she returned to Thailand to try and convert people to Christianity. Not only to Thailand generally, but to the monastery where she trained. She was trying to convince the young nuns, the young monks, oh, like Jesus is the way, you have to come, and this is the only way to salvation. And this was quite upsetting to a lot of people in the community, a lot of the monastics even, and so they went to Ajahn Chah, who was the abbot of the monastery. And like, what do we do? She's like telling everyone that they have to convert to Christianity. What do we do? And Ajahn Chah just pauses and says, well, maybe she's right, and did nothing. And eventually this woman just went away on her own. And to me, I think that's so amazing. He's dedicated his entire life to this practice, this path, and it's like, no, maybe she's right. Just let her be. And so I do want to add here that, in life, of course, at times you have to take sides. Even Ajahn Chah, obviously, he chose the side of becoming a monastic. He chose the side of following certain rules. All the time we have to choose sides, but the idea is usually we're taking sides because we're bound by our conditioning, we're bound by our reactions. We cannot be in the middle with a sense of equanimity, a sense of balance, a sense of openness. We feel like we have to be on one side or the other. So obviously those are examples from life, generally speaking, but also in meditation. We view with a feeling of pain in the body without taking sides. Oh, I have to get rid of this. This is bad. This is good. Hey, can we sit with a difficult thought, not want it to go away? We be in the middle with it. Can we have a pleasant feeling, a pleasant fantasy in the mind, and not cling to it? So it's very hard not to attach to things we like and, have aversion to things we don't like. And the reality is in our lives, when we're not intentional, we can orient our whole lives around this idea of just being a little more comfortable, having a little more pleasantness, having a little less pain, having a little less discomfort. Again, it's sort of your animal nature in a way. So when you sit to meditate, it's basically going against our conditioning, not trying to categorize things into good and bad or right or wrong, to be able to stay in the middle. And so the reason I want to talk specifically about pleasure and pain is because I think of pleasure and pain a little differently than just some of the other 8 worldly winds. When we have praise and blame, for example. And I work with people and, as a therapist all the time, and they're like, oh, I can't let go. Someone blamed me for something, or I got criticism and I can't let it go. And yeah, it's very hard to do that. But I ask them, okay, well, when you got praise, did you let that go or did you cling to it? Did you take it very personally? Did you see it as something just sort of fleeting? Like the wise noble disciples that they mentioned in the Lokavipatta Sutta, or like the unlearned ordinary person. Oh, this is about me. This is permanent. This says I am like this and I'm not like that. And so it makes sense that we don't want to cling to these things. It makes a logical sense to be in the middle. But pleasure and pain, I view as a bit unique. And so, of course, we know first things from the reason I want to talk about it firstly is because a lot of times, just the way pleasure is talked about in Buddhist context, it seems like it's the enemy. And sometimes we perceive the teachings as almost like a rejection of pleasure. And it's true, pleasure in itself, again, by doing this practice, we're somewhat rejecting the premise of hedonism, but that doesn't mean we need to reject pleasure itself. And we know from the Buddha's own story, his own life, that, he tried this path of basically rejecting all pleasure, all satiation for the body. He nearly starved himself to death. They say you could see his spine from the front through his stomach because he was rejecting all food. And then he famously took the rice milk and settled on the middle way, between the luxuries of his childhood and early life, where he had every luxury, every sensual pleasure he could imagine, and then this more ascetic experience where he rejected all of it. And so pleasure and pain, though, are fundamental somewhat to the experience of being human in a way that I think is different than the worldly ones. And I think that it's because pleasure and pain is the fundamental tool for how humans and animals learn and change, basically. It's how we learn how to interact with our environment. So I'll expand on this a little bit, but first I want to say that if being on the path, if meditating does not bring people some pleasure, I often find people won't stay on the path long enough for them to find peace with it. Again, pleasure is oftentimes how we learn something is good or bad. So, the main thing I tell the people who start meditating, and I've heard this from other teachers as well, is that you need to make it fun, make it enjoyable. You have to find some pleasure in it. And what I often see is that, in the West, we are so, such drivers and so goal oriented. And we're also so self-loathing. That it's almost like when we do something like meditation practice, trying to improve ourselves, it's almost like we feel like we need to suffer. We're supposed to be suffering during it. Of course, suffering, part of the path, of course, but it's almost like, I view it somewhat as sort of a Judeo-Christian mindset in our culture. It's like we have to pay penance for original sin of being imperfect. And so a lot of times on the path, it seems like there's it's like it's supposed to be unpleasant. It's supposed to be painful. Actually, just at the beginning of this call, described meditating by yourself sometimes to Jerry is very dreary. So it comes from everyone. But there are these famous stories too of, Eastern teachers coming to the States and being somewhat taken aback by seeing people practicing here. Because there's a story of Thich Nhat Hanh, who once went to the San Francisco Zen Center and then asked, okay, what can we do differently? Do you have any advice for us? And he said, well, I would probably wake up a little later than what you do, and I would breathe more and smile more. And there's a very similar story. The Dalai Lama came to the Insight Meditation Society many decades ago. And basically, he asked the teachers, he's like, why does everyone here look so somber? If you've been on a retreat, you see people like slowly kind of walking around, and everyone can look so sad. And so, pleasure is not the enemy of practice. It's very much a natural state that can arise. And in the teachings, the Buddha describes when we reach certain levels of concentration, are called jhanas. He describes basically two elements arising with that level of concentration, well, piti and sukha, which means like delight and happiness. And so pleasure itself is sort of the manifestation of concentration, but it's also important that concentration can rest more easily with pleasurable sensations. And that's what we were doing in the meditation today. It's easier to concentrate on pleasurable sensations than unpleasant sensations oftentimes. And so that's why it's useful to do this exercise of being with the feeling tones of the body, called Vedana, unpleasant, the neutral, the pleasant, and being with the pleasant sensations. Okay? So it's also true that sometimes a concentrated mind doesn't naturally arise in practice for us. And so how do we do that? And I suggested some of those ways in our meditation today. The Buddha often suggested that we reflect on our own good deeds, our meritorious acts, these positive things, these feelings of like metta, like loving kindness. We rejoice in our own goodness and our own actions. Because again, this is how humans learn and change. Pleasant feelings and unpleasant feelings, that's sort of the most fundamental level of, oh, this is something I should do more of, this is something I should do less of. So we create these pleasant sensations, and that drives us to want to engage more in these pleasant activities. And of course, we know if we do that with, things that are unwholesome, these vices, there can be immediate pleasant sensations. But if we are mindful, we can actually find the lack of pleasant sensations in the long term with those. But it requires a lot of sustained mindfulness, a lot of samadhi to be able to do that. So we can do things like conjure up a memory, something that makes us feel good. We can even do something like, if we're going to do a mindful eating practice, you can mindfully eat something delicious. And that can be very enjoyable. We have to make the practice pleasurable in order to stick with it at times. So the Buddha describes pleasant sensations in the body as what he called blameless sensations, sensations that don't harm anybody. Again, great for establishing concentration, also great for exploring the nature of reality. It's like I said during the meditation, just like all sensations, pleasant sensations are impermanent. So we can use pleasant sensations to increase our level of concentration and have a more sustained level of mindfulness for longer. We can become more aware of impermanence as it arises and passes away, because it's much more easy to be immersed in pleasure. So we can also, there's a practice in Tibetan Buddhism that I absolutely love called universalizing. And universalizing is a practice where basically we find ourselves in a state of pleasure or a state of pain. And then we wish for all beings to have this pleasure. We wish for no beings to have this pain. And again, this is about not attaching to the sensations themselves, but using the sensations as a way of connecting to our larger sense of being. We can do this because we can be so immersed in pleasant sensations and become concentrated. It's easier to see the non-duality of reality. So, I share all this to say that using pleasant sensations and finding pleasure on the path can be extremely instructive, be extremely fruitful. If you've ever read any Rick Hanson, it's a Buddhist neuroscientist. He has books like The Buddha's Brain, Hardwiring for Happiness. He talks a lot about this concept of basically generating positive states of mind because we're training our mind to continually come back to those states of mind. It's the neurons that fire together, wire together. Okay? The mind has to be trained to come into these positive states again and again. Like the Buddha said, we have positive states, we can rejoice on those. We can reflect on our own goodness, our own good deeds. The Buddha also loved to go out in nature. And that's a very pleasant thing to do. We can find pleasure through curiosity. We can find pleasure through practicing and sharing together, which is why it's so great we're here all practicing together. And so, and you can also find practice in making it funny. So let me ask a question. What did the Buddha say at the hot dog stand? He said, make me one with everything. Funny. Okay, I didn't make that up, but things like that help make meditation fun, help make dharma, which can seem dry at times, depending on how it's presented. Okay? Make it fun, make it something we want to come back to again and again. Because the reality is we don't have to find and search that hard for pain. Psychological, physical, it will be there. But our practice can include pleasure as well. It's part of the middle way. It is clinging to pleasure that is not. So, Bhante Rahula on this retreat was talking about how more than half of monastics, disrobe or end up not completing their life as a monk or a nun. And he says oftentimes it's because there's such a rejection of sensual pleasure, and people are so attached to that. And so again, we don't need to become attached to sensual pleasure, but to totally reject sensual pleasure, to totally reject pleasure generally, is to basically create a jack-in-the-box effect where we're just repressing something that's part of our nature. And so we don't want to totally reject it. The practice is about no parts left out, about welcoming all things in, and that's including pleasure. So, I shared at the beginning of the talk the etymology of MEDI. Means middle. So then when I got home from retreat, I was somewhat curious about, okay, well, what is the second part of meditate? What is the tate part, the TATE? And so I'm far from an etymology expert. And again, meditate obviously wasn't the word that the Buddha used. English was not in existence. But I found this very helpful to me when I looked up tate. It comes from Norse roots and it means cheerfully or gladly. So my request for you as we wrap up this Dharma talk is to practice being in the middle, but do it cheerfully, gladly, with joy. Find the pleasure of being in the middle. So thank you all. And so now we have some space. We'll stop the recording.